Excellent. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning to those of you who are out on the West Coast, or I guess I should say good day to everybody who might be coming in from some other part of the world. We tend to get quite a lot of different time zones participating in these type of events. I'm really thankful that all of you were able to join us today. For those of you who have gotten familiar with the tempo of pilots reporting to the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group, you'll know that each of our pilots is supposed to report twice a year. We were scheduled when we were supposed to have the in-person plenary back in October at NIST to have an afternoon that would be focused exclusively on the session we're now going to have today. Unfortunately, forces didn't align so well in terms of the government staying open, and with the government shutdown, we ended up having to instead have the in-person meeting postponed. It was very encouraging to see IDESG members run with things on their own and turn that into an all-virtual plenary. However, because of the... Sorry, Laura, can you mute other people? I'm getting a lot of feedback from somebody else. Thank you. Because we weren't able to actually have the in-person meeting, the IDSG made a decision to have a bit of a shorter virtual plenary that focused on some other matters at hand and to postpone having the pilots update until a later time. So this update that we're having today from the original 5 NSTIC pilots is really the session that we would have had back in October. We'll be gathering next month down in Atlanta at the Georgia Tech Research Institute for our next in-person plenary. If you haven't registered, you can do so today at idecosystem.org. And at that plenary, we will be hearing from the 5 new NSTIC pilots that were awarded in September of 2013. A little bit of background leading into the discussion today. I think some of you have heard this from me, but some of you are new to the group. Support for pilot projects has always been a very key component of the public-private partnership that was called for in the NSTIC. And there's a reason for this. The NSTIC is, at the end of the day, a strategy. It's essentially an aspirational document that lays out a vision of the future, this identity ecosystem, but the ecosystem doesn't exist today. And the charge that we're given within the NSTIC National Program Office is to make it exist and take specific steps that can help to bridge the gap between the strategy and its actual execution. Pilot projects are one of the best ways to get from the theoretical to the actual. Just a word on the pilots in terms of what we've awarded so far. We currently have 12 active NSTIC pilots. 5 of them are the ones you'll hear from today that were awarded in 2012. We had a second tranche that was awarded in 2013, and then additional 2 NSTIC pilots that were also awarded in October, funded separately from the NSTIC budget. This was actually some money from another part of the White House called the Partnership Fund for Program Integrity Innovation. 2 pilots that were focused on leveraging identity systems that align with NSTIC to help improve the delivery of benefits in state governments. And Michigan and Pennsylvania have kicked those off. They'll be reporting at another plenary, probably not in Atlanta. We are expecting, and this is important news, to put out another federal funding opportunity for what would be the 3rd round of NSTIC pilots, probably in late January. We are still looking to be able to figure out exactly how much money we're going to have, depending on, for those who've been following, there is a bipartisan budget deal that has finally been agreed upon. We are still not quite sure how all of that is going to flow down to us, and so we're not exactly sure how much we're going to be able to actually fund in January, but we should hopefully have news on that soon, so stay tuned there. The early signs that we're getting are quite positive, I think, in terms of where our budget should be in the next year. When the first round of our pilots was awarded about a year ago, we had a lot of questions from folks asking what, if any, formal relationship would exist between the pilots and the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group. There were a number of steering group members that asked if they would have some sort of formal oversight role of the pilots, and the answer we gave was a very clear no. Not that we didn't want to involve the steering group, but these are government grants. They're only being able to be managed by the government, and we'd actually have some real big legal challenges doing anything but. But we tried to make clear from the start, and I hope people have seen over the last year, that just because the steering group does not have a formal oversight role, it doesn't diminish the importance of the complementary relationship that the pilots and the steering group must have with each other. For starters, we've mandated, as I mentioned, that all the pilots report at least twice annually to the group. And we've also made clear that we expect the pilots to be active participants in the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group and look to take some of the work products that emerge from the steering group into account as their pilots proceed. We also think, and this is a very important point from our perspective, that the lessons that are learned from the pilots will help to inform the deliberations of the steering group and hopefully provide some of the concrete answers to some of the theoretical questions the steering group might struggle with. I think we've certainly seen in both plenary and all of the committees, there's a lot that we can talk about, but sometimes we end up getting stuck on certain issues without any clear catalyst to actually try and push things forward. Our hope is that the pilots, because they're actually struggling with active projects that are dealing with some of the same issues that we might be talking about in more of the theoretical side of things within the steering group, can help to overcome some of the stasis that may come in when you are having a theoretical debate, and if you can actually bring in some practical, real-world problems or results, can help to move things forward. I know that today's format, because we only got about 3 hours, only allows for a limited amount of time for members to consider the work of the pilots. I want to say that if any of the folks on this call in the steering group feel the need to do a deeper dive to the pilots or on particular issues they're dealing with, what I'd like to ask is that you work with the appropriate Identity Ecosystem Steering Group Committee to reach out to them, or us for that matter, if some help from the National Program Office is needed to facilitate these discussions. But I think what we'd really love to see is, working through some of the committee chairs, if there are more detailed questions, please work things that way so that the broadest group of participants can actually benefit from the discussions. Beyond, I think what you'll hear today, if there's a common set of lessons that we can all learn from the collective experience of the pilots, it really only underscores the need for a robust identity ecosystem framework. It's really been fascinating to us as all the different pilots, which are all really doing very different things, have progressed. They've all really run up against the same handful of issues, and I'm going to attempt now to throw up a couple slides by sharing my desktop, so hang on just a moment. I just want to run through a couple things. Is that up there? Looks like everybody can see. Good. So some common considerations. This is a set of blogs we actually started posting several months ago at our NSTIC blog site, which the link is up at the top of the screen. We decided to take a lot of these lessons learned and turn them into a series of blogs, in part to share them with the broader community. And we actually haven't posted any new blogs in some time, but just to take a couple slides to sort of run through some of the things that we've been seeing most recently. What we sort of would dub, common considerations or areas of mutual interest that the pilots are dealing with, and the steering group we think should be looking to as well, as the pilots inform the work of the group. The first is around the topic of trust frameworks and certifications. And the pilots, we're seeing different communities of interest defining the requirements for new trust frameworks that are necessary to enable the pilots to move forward. We'd love to see, as this is happening, if we could see some of our interest-focused committees, like the healthcare and financial committees, be able to help capture and present some of these requirements to the Trust Framework and Trustmark Committee. Since there is good work going on in the pilots and there's good work going on in the committee, how can we try to join the two of those? The second is with identity ecosystem participant contracts. We're finding getting the legal side of these things as done can really be quite hard, and the pilots are learning a lot of lessons that even though they might have support from somebody in the identity or security group of an organization or the business group of an organization, when the agreements to participate in these pilots hit the lawyers, there's not a lot that's really out there that they have to go off of, and in some cases the lawyers have been uncomfortable with moving things forward as quickly as we'd like to see. So we're hoping that some of the lessons that are coming out of this can actually inform work perhaps on sample legal templates as an idea for the steering group to try and put out as a deliverable. We'd also love to explore whether it's possible to set up a library of contracts that are emerging from what's coming out of these pilots on the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group site, so that others that are involved in identity federation efforts might be able to draw from them and reuse from things that have been of good use in the past. One thing you'll hear today from Ken Klingenstein at Internet 2 is some talk about the periodic table of trust elements. This is something that we talked a little bit about with a recent blog we put out as asking if we're there yet. It was a little bit tongue-in-cheek on the interim identity ecosystem framework. Ken's talked a lot about, can we come up with this table of elements that we could use as a toolkit to identify common trust framework provider elements that would all conform to our guiding principles. And, one idea is that these, elements could then be a pathway to better mutual recognition of some of the trust framework providers. Moving beyond trust frameworks, standards gaps are areas where we're still, certainly seeing another common thread. A lot of excitement about OpenID Connect as a new specification from a lot of identity providers, but we are finding getting some of the reliant parties comfortable with it just because it's the new kid on the block. We're seeing, in the commercial space, at least a couple, pushing back because they just don't know what it is yet, and I think it's going to take a little bit of time for the message to spread. It's frankly not unlike what we're seeing in the government as we look to try and push our own profile of Connect forward to work alongside things like SAML and OpenID 2.0. There is some work to be done there. One question that's also come up, we always point out from this that Special Pub 863 should not be the guiding document here. It's designed for government electronic authentication, and there's frankly some things that are in it that may not be ideal for the private sector. But despite that, it still seems to be one of the few things that are out there that people keep coming back to. And then, of course, NIST gets, asked, why is it that we can't support this new technology or that? And this is, frankly, playing catch-up a lot of times when you look at Table 7 in that document that looks at different types of authentication technologies. And so there's been some question of, should the steering group or one of the SDOs that we work with be asked to try and come up with some sort of a table that might be similar to Table 7, but for commercial use that could perhaps be a little bit more ahead of the curve than what NIST is able to do with its 863 updates. And one benefit of that from the NIST side is that, of course, would then be a roadmap of things that the government should be looking at and bringing new authentication methods into the government's fold. We're finding the functional model definition. There's still a lot that's more defining. I guess you're getting more specific on things is required. By that we mean identity functions. Well, 863 may define things one way. When you really look at who's doing what within an identity ecosystem, different functions are being implemented with different actors, in many cases in very different ways within different pilots. You have separate identity proofing and credential authentication, as well as a lot of different intermediary components. And there's not really a clear definition of who's doing what that we can actually point to between some of the pilots that's been particularly consistent. We think this is an area where some clearer definition and boundaries are going to be eventually needed to separate responsibilities for security and privacy as well as to facilitate certification. If we don't have this, some of the predictability and accountability that we think is going to be needed to underpin the identity ecosystem framework, these are things that remain elusive. And going back up to the top of the screen, it's the kind of things that can also spook some of the attorneys because there isn't a great precedent of how this has been done before, and thus, how it should be repeated in the next time somebody's deploying a system. Three more areas to talk about. Privacy. So we had a great success with the privacy evaluation matrix emerging quickly from the Privacy Coordination Committee and the steering group. It's really been an effective tool for the pilots to use to help illuminate some of their privacy considerations, and it's really become more or less a standard that they're all using now. However, a number of the pilots have said that, given that it is a, early document still, there has not been a ton of descriptive guidance regarding how they should be using it, and some have asked for a little bit more guidance beyond what has been provided thus far in the document. We're also seeing a lack of standards and definition around concepts like what does it mean to be anonymous, what is unlinkability, what is unobservability. Different firms and stakeholders describe it different ways. It's not to say anyone is wrong or right, but when the term is used a little bit cavalierly sometimes, it does not help to actually drive a common understanding of what people are talking about. And the third thing I wanted to talk about, so I think we talked a few months ago about the problem we've seen with data promiscuity. Data minimization is a key principle of, key privacy principle of the NSTIC. The idea being that the only data that should be shared in the transaction are those minimal data points that are actually necessary for the transaction. But one of the lessons that we learned working with a lot of different commercial attribute providers is that, rather than data minimization being the norm, it was what Colin Suter, who works for Deloitte supporting our office, dubbed as data promiscuity. Not as exciting as it sounds, but it basically means a lot of data about people flying around sort of willy-nilly everywhere. I think in part because these pilots have leaned on their partners with some support from our office, we've actually seen some of the commercial providers move now to what we would consider, data temperance practices, moving back towards the spirit of the NSTIC, which is exciting for us. But we now love to see the steering group contemplate whether some of these new practices ought to be memorialized in standards or trust mark definitions or other best practices that, again, could be shared and reused. You'll notice there's a common theme here in terms of what it is we're looking to see. The Privacy Manager is something you'll also hear about today from Internet2 and Ken Klingenstein. It's a very interesting tool from our perspective, looking at different ways to essentially present to the end user what data of theirs is being shared and how they react to it. We think, based on some of the early work that they're doing, we'd love to see the steering group explore it a little bit more and analyze some of the different outputs. And finally, a couple other considerations. One, relying party recruitment still remains a challenge for some pilots. We, have a lot of good pilot lessons learned that we think can help, be fed into the steering group value proposition, but that have been, some of the pilots have found it is one thing to get a commitment letter that they'll participate. It's another to actually get them to sign and turn things on, doing identity a different way. And another big issue, and I think you'll hear a couple of pilots talk about it today, is around credential interoperability, credential branding, and the user experience. There's a lot of trade-offs that people find when you take the 4 guiding principles that are in NSTIC and actually have to build them into a design. And sometimes turning up the dial on one may lead to a trade-off that another one does not work quite as well. It's not to say that you can't actually have all 4 coexist, only that some of the folks in the marketplace are still sorting out what is the best way to do that. So there we'd love to see some collaboration between the steering groups, user experience, security, privacy, and standards committees to provide input. There's a bottom line here. I think it's that the pilots have made clear there's a ton of work to be done to advance the identity ecosystem, and this identity ecosystem steering group is a very valuable and necessary forum in which to address the issues. There candidly isn't anything quite like it. I'm going to now unshare my monitor and go back to just a couple closing remarks. So I think, now we'll get on with our pilots. I think you'll see, that they are making good progress in a lot of places and struggling in some places. And it should hopefully underpin the importance of this body, the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group, and the good work that it is doing. Overall, the pilots we've been really excited about. They've been blazing new paths forward, demonstrating how they can take some new approaches to address some traditional barriers to federated identity management and bringing some new types of players to the table that have never been there before. Also showing how some new twists on the same old can make a real difference in moving the market forward. So our order today, we'll hear first from Dayon, then AMVA, then Criterion, then Internet2, and then Resilient. They'll each have about 20 minutes. We won't do questions in the middle. But then we'll take about 10 minutes for questions at the end of each one and then wrap up with a broader pilots discussion. So with that, Laura, if I can ask you to hand the screen over to Kathy at Dayon. Thanks.